So there's a lot of controversy over who can diagnose dyslexia and when is the appropriate time to have your child screened or to actually get a good diagnosis. Since dyslexia is neurologically based, it's there at birth. There are signs that we kind of look for. There are things that make the child more at risk. So, for instance, if you have a family history of dyslexia or learning disabilities, that automatically puts you at greater risk. Does that mean that that child is going to definitely be dyslexic? No. But I'm going to monitor their development and progress more closely in order to determine if it goes off track and why it could possibly be going off track. The second is if the child has a history of a speech or language impairment or a persistent speech and language impairment. That puts the child at greater risk. So for a child whose skills are kind of on the borderline, those are the two things that I need to know in order to determine safely which way the child is going to go. It's long been assumed that you couldn't test a child's reading ability until they had been in school for a while. And there's truth in that, in the sense of, I'm not going to ask you to read something if I've never taught you to read. But there are all those foundation skills that have to be developed by preschool. And that comes into play with your phonological processing. Those are skills that are emergent literacy. Those are skills that should be developed before you ever have formal reading instruction. So if you have a child, a preschooler, who is struggling to learn the days of the week, memory for sequences is an area of weakness. Can't say the Pledge of Allegiance. When they're talking, and we all think it's cute if they call it an aminal versus an animal, okay? But they have trouble keeping the sounds in order. They're mixing up the sounds. The child is shying away from any kind of print. Like, they're not attempting to show scribbles or things like that that would indicate that they understand that these symbols represent some kind of meaning. So when you're evaluating young children, you're looking at their overall language skills, because dyslexia is a language-based learning disability. That's why, especially the younger the child is, a highly trained speech pathologist should be the lead in the diagnosing, because our test instruments are more sensitive to specific skills. So I'm looking at their auditory discrimination. I'm looking at their phonological processing. How are they rhyming? How difficult is it for the parent to teach the child the sounds and the symbols and things like that? As they get older, then I'm going to, do more traditional looking reading tests. We have this misconception that nothing can be diagnosed until second grade. Well, that has more to do with the kind of test instruments available at that time, as opposed to the presence of warning signs. So when you look developmentally, some children may have those warning signs, and they may not be dyslexic. But regardless of whether we feel like they're dyslexic or not, they still require the same kind of intervention. Very systematic, very incremental, because that's going to help any child learn to read. And it's going to lay the foundation for the dyslexic. If they're truly dyslexic, there will be things that linger on into adulthood, because it is a neurologically based learning disability. But it's in the language system. So you can identify characteristics very early. You can give a sound diagnosis by first grade. Some can even in kindergarten, depending on how much family history you have, knowledge of that, and then has the child been in intervention. An intervention isn't always just hiring somebody to work with your child. If you're reading with your child every night at home, you're practicing letters, you're doing all these things that parents are encouraged to do, and they don't seem to be sticking or making a positive impact, then you need to have the child screened. That doesn't mean that the child's going to be dyslexic, But if I can identify where the weaknesses are, I can begin to address those weaknesses immediately. And then they become remediated weaknesses instead of develop into a disability that then results in frustration, anxiety. Oftentimes kids are mistaken as being having attention issues like ADHD because they're not attending to the page. Well, I don't know what those symbols mean. I don't know what they're communicating to me, and so I'm going to find other ways to entertain myself. You have to rule out all these other possibilities. What is the child's processing ability? Some children were initially diagnosed as having auditory processing disorders. Phonological processing is one component of auditory processing. So those kids are typically misdiagnosed dyslexics. We have put up strong fences traditionally around professionals. This professional can diagnose this professional can diagnose that. And there needs to be some consistency, but whoever gives a diagnosis of dyslexia needs to be very trained in how to identify it. There's very specific tests that need to be given, very specific areas. Just because they do an achievement test, an IQ test, does not mean that they're going to pick up on dyslexia. You have to have a measure of phonological processing. So if you have an evaluation and there was not a measure of phonological processing, that is not a dyslexia evaluation. You have to have a measure of phonological processing because that is the core deficit. And then you have to take into consideration that not all tests are the same. Some tests inflate scores for some children, especially if the parents have worked a lot with that child at home. If some tests, the reason we didn't test children when they were younger on achievement tests was because the child wasn't required to do a whole lot. Therefore, if they got anything right, it made it look like everything was okay. And so examiners discouraged doing those types of evaluations because it was misleading. It gave the impression that everything was developing typically when in reality it wasn't. So there's logical reasons of why certain misconceptions have developed over time. But regardless of whether we say the child's dyslexic or it's something else, the bottom line is there are critical skills that are not developing. And I don't know how to educate that child and remediate those deficits if I don't evaluate the whole system and look and see what is weak. Because if it's weak for a reason other than being dyslexic, when I provide the dyslexia intervention, they are going to take off and it's going to be no problem. But if I sit and I wait and I wonder if this is developmental, it's not, okay? It's not going to miraculously develop on its own, regardless of the reason why it's there. There has to be specific things addressed. And you don't know what to specifically address if you do not evaluate the skill set and evaluate all the skill sets. We have a tendency when we're teaching and when we're intervening to gravitate towards instructing more on the skills that the child is successful with, because we all like to be successful. That's not what we need to do. We have to identify the weakest parts and systematically address and remediate those. And if those are addressed and remediated, then we have the foundation, and then we can build on other skills. But if that foundation is not there, regardless of the reason why, if it's not there, it's not there. So children who come from low literacy homes or are in environments where there isn't a lot of support at home, okay, we can't change that. We cannot change someone's socioeconomic status. We cannot change their race. We can't change any of those things. Yet, most people call those the culprit for illiteracy, and they're not. Do some of those factors, if I haven't been read to a lot, if I'm not exposed to books a lot, is that going to impact me? Yes, possibly it will. It puts you at greater risk. but it does not mean that you have to be illiterate. But it does mean, as an educator, I have to find out what skills are missing so that when you are in my classroom from 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, I'm systematically addressing those. Because if the weakness is the result of not being exposed to it, then my instruction is going to have a positive impact. And then that child is ready for school. We can complain about why children aren't ready for school, and we can blame it on parents. We can blame it on a million different things. But it doesn't change the fact that that child showed up in my classroom and isn't prepared. And it's my responsibility as an educator to prepare that child for what comes next in their educational career, regardless of what's going on at home or what isn't going on at home. I have a responsibility in those hours. And if I don't take the time to piece apart what's really going on, then my instruction is not going to be as beneficial, because more than likely I'm going to jump in at a level that's beyond what the child can handle. So if we go back and talk about phonemic awareness, if I start trying to teach phonemic awareness and matching up symbols, and you can't rhyme or you can't segment the individual words in a sentence, you're not ready for phonemic awareness. So it does not matter how wonderful my lesson is, how fantastic of a teacher I am. If my child does not have the prerequisite skills needed to master that particular skill, it's not going to happen. Maybe we make them proficient enough to be ready for the next lesson, but that depth of knowledge is not there, and at some point the demand will become too great and it will fall through that hole, that weak spot. And we owe it to our children to give them the educational opportunity, because the only way you can change your socioeconomic status is by affording yourself a variety of opportunities when you get done with school. And if I can read and I can write, then I can go to college, or I can complete an application for any kind of job I want. But if I cannot read and write, I'm very limited in my opportunities. When somebody fills out a job application, if you receive it and it has a whole bunch of misspelled words, how many people actually call that person? Or does it end up in the trash? And that might be the very best person for the job. But because of dyslexia or whatever the reason, we didn't ever give them a chance. And so how many children are we not giving a chance? Because before they show up to school, they're not ready for what we're trying to teach them. And instead of preparing them and making them ready, we're finding other reasons to blame that on.